Bring me my angry wig. Again.
Right. I've had enough. Every year we come to Hungary. And every single flaming year, McLando somehow managed to invent an entirely new way to annoy me. Hungary deserves better. Oscar deserves better. And frankly, so do the fans. Roll the intro before my blood pressure reaches max levels. G'day, legends. Uncle Cranky Koala here. Apparently Papaya Koala has been told to calm down, so they've sent me. Terrible mistake. Because unlike Papaya, I don't calm down. Today we're talking Hungary, where McLando once again demonstrate that they apparently believe Formula One fans have the memory of goldfish and the observational skills of a potato. Let's get into it. Everything discussed today comes from publicly available timing data, FIA documents, team radio, interviews, and the official television broadcast. Any opinions expressed are exactly that, opinions. Although some of them seem to upset people far more than simple opinions usually do. Practice starts, and immediately something catches the eye. Lando is absolutely flying. Wonderful. Fantastic. Then we discover why. Oscar doesn't have the new floor. Lando gets the upgrade. Oscar doesn't. Now tell me, how exactly are you supposed to compare practice pace when one bloke is driving the upgraded version and the other blokey isn't? Then later they'll happily use those practice times as evidence that Lando reserved qualifying priority. Really? That's like giving one bloke running shoes, the other bloke thongs or flip-flops for our non-Aussie friends, then acting shocked when the bloke in the runners is quicker. Funny how that works. Qualifying arrives, and George once again has mysterious problems. Well, not George, his car. Funny how that's becoming a theme. First Rosberg, then Alonso, then Oscar, now George. There always seems to be one driver in these big teams whose machinery develops a sudden case of selective incompetence when they don't suit the approved narrative. What extraordinary luck. Oscar finally gets the floor upgrade, after Lando's had it all flamin' weekend. Funny how that works, isn't it? Equal machinery, my furry little koala backside. Except Oscar's had no practice with it. No setup work, no meaningful data, nothing. Meanwhile, Lando has spent every practice session learning exactly how to make his upgrade work. Again. One driver gets all the preparation. The other gets thrown into qualifying and told,
Yeah, good luck, mate.
Yeah, good luck, mate. If McLando couldn't finish both upgrades, then neither driver should have had it. Simple. But somehow Lando always gets new parts first. Every single time. Q3 and Oscar starts putting together a beautiful flying lap. Purple-looking sectors, everything coming together. And then Lewis appears. Now, before anyone gets upset, Lewis is an all-time great. Nobody questions that. But he has developed an unfortunate habit over the years. Once he's finished his own flying lap, he seems to enjoy taking a leisurely Sunday drive directly on the racing line. Normally, he somehow escapes punishment. This time it was simply too obvious. Oscar has to abandon the lap. Front row gone. Even the stewards couldn't pretend not to notice that one, and a 3-place grid penalty is issued. Then came Kimi. Another 3-place grid penalty, speeding through yellows after Max's spin. Initially, the sheep commentary tried desperately to convince everyone he'd get away with it. Then telemetry arrived. Purple sector. Under yellows. Oops. Turns out the stewards couldn't ignore that one either. So, Lando gets pole, Charles moves to second, Oscar starts third, Max fourth. Amazing what happens when rules are actually enforced. Of course the excuses arrive almost immediately. Apparently Oscar struggles in low grip conditions. Again, honestly I'm amazed this BS is still getting airtime. Stella says that
tracks with 10-15% lower baseline grip, like Austin, Miami, Baku and Zandvoort, require heavy compromises to Oscar's natural corner entry technique.
Wait, what?
Because Stella's own examples seem to prove the exact opposite. We've already seen Oscar excel on low-grip circuits, winning in Baku 2024, dominating Miami 2025, and taking a Grand Slam at Zandvoort 2025. So if low grip supposedly compromises Oscar's natural driving style, why does he keep being so flaming good at low-grip tracks? The narrative isn't narrating, Stella. But the evidence is evidencing. Wet races, slippery weekends, mixed conditions, Oscar does just fine on low grip as long as he isn't the recipient of strategy shenanigans.
And/or
Experimental setup!
Yet somehow, every time they need another excuse, out comes the old favorite.
Low grip.
Low grip. It's becoming Formula One's version of,
The dog ate my homework.
Then Stella says something that genuinely made me stop the television. Apparently,
Oscar's smooth driving style makes him slower.
sorry, what? Has this bloke ever even watched motor racing? Every kid who's ever climbed into a kart has heard the saying, smooth is fast, messy is slow. That's practically carved into stone tablets somewhere. Yet Stella wants us to believe Lando's messy driving is actually quicker. Interesting, because Toto's been trying to convince everyone that Kimi's incredibly messy driving is actually smooth as well, in order to justify his speed. Funny coincidence. Neither Kimi nor Lando are smooth. Both of them drive like they're wrestling crocodiles half the lap. They're quick, but not because they're smooth. They're quick because they're being given every possible advantage. Big difference. One genuinely nice moment. Casey Stoner was at the circuit supporting Oscar. Now that's something Australians understand. We look after our own. Casey is one of the greatest motorcycle racers that's ever lived. His career was cut far too short by chronic fatigue syndrome. So seeing him healthy, smiling, and backing another Aussie champion was genuinely lovely. More of that, please. Lights out. Oscar absolutely nails the launch. Beautiful start. Gets alongside, then gets ahead. Leads within a few corners. Outstanding. And what do the commentary team say? Lando defended brilliantly. Did he? Because from where I was sitting, Oscar overtook him. Apparently overtaking someone now counts as evidence that the bloke being overtaken defended well. That's certainly creative commentary. Then they go one better. They call Lando's mistake a gift to Oscar. No. Oscar forced the mistake. There's a difference. When you're close enough to pressure someone into making an error, that's called racing. Oscar didn't receive a gift. He earned it. Charles gets a poor start. George gets an even worse one. Except George explains afterwards exactly what happened.
I was on the throttle holding the revs, and then all of a sudden, about 4 seconds before the lights went out, the engine just started revving all over the place.
Anti-stall kicks in. Race over before it began. Toto later describes the systems as out of sync. Funny phrase that. Because Stella used almost exactly the same wording last year in Mexico when Oscar's car mysteriously went wrong. Out of sync. That's certainly one way of describing it. Another might simply be, George has become the latest bloke getting the short straw. We've been giving George the short straw. Meanwhile, the commentators remind us Oscar now has pit priority. Ah yes, pit priority. The famous McLando pit priority. The one where Oscar gets priority. Right up until Lando starts complaining. Then they use that pit priority to force a detrimental strategy change on Oscar. Last year, Oscar had pit priority. And that priority cost him the race. Lap 10. And here we go again. Lando whinges.
I go quicker in clean air for sure.
The same goes for all the cars in this era, Lando. Wise Owl Will asks Lando about the tires. Lando replies,
Dirty air, really. I'm much faster.
There it is, the code phrase. Translation?
Please remove Oscar from in front of me so I can have the clean air.
If you're genuinely much faster, there's a radical concept in motor racing. Pass him. Instead, Oscar maintains the gap, managing the tires as directed by Snake.
Tires are stabilized. We're happy with less management.
Oh yes, that's right. Oscar wasn't slower than Lando. He was managing tires as he was told to, and keeping Lando frustrated in his dirty air. Lando is racing. Oscar is managing the lead. Meanwhile, Max is wrestling an absolute handful, complaining about shifts, complaining about balance. The car genuinely looks difficult. Lewis then says,
Max is really slow.
Mate, perhaps the more accurate sentence would have been,
I still can't get past him.
Lewis briefly gets through, The commentators lose their minds. Then Max immediately,
Thanks! I'll have that place back.
normal service resumes. Snake says,
How's the tires? We are thinking plan A.
whoa, plan A again? Don't do it, Oscar. That's how they stole your win last year. Then there is a discussion about which plan Oscar should take, plan A or plan B. Oscar says his tires are fine, but doesn't choose a plan, most likely because he's trying to work out which plan they're trying to use to screw him over. Meanwhile, Lando's whining again.
They need to do something.
In other words, get Oscar out of my way.
Max is going to close in.
No, he isn't. He's got car problems.
I want to box this lap.
Lando, we can't.
You mean you won't let me?
He tries again.
I'm miles faster.
Really? Then why don't you just pass? Eventually, Lando's biggest fan, Snake, takes control and tells Oscar,
Box.
not because Oscar has chosen a plan, not because Oscar needs to box, but because Lando is demanding the team pit Oscar out of his way. And being McLando, they were only too happy to oblige.
My tires, dirty air, my tires!
Lando is whinging about dirty air. Again. No problem, I'll just pit Oscar out of the way, so it's easier for Lando.
And despite getting his clean air, Lando couldn't close the gap, and even with Oscar slowed by traffic, he still exited behind Oscar. Doesn't really demonstrates that
Miles faster.
Lando was talking about. Lap 25. Kimi receives one track limits warning. Just one. Despite the television broadcast already showing at least 3 clear excursions. The stewards continue their fascinating inability to notice Kimi visiting neighboring postcodes. Quite the mystery, really. Then we reach the part that finally sends Uncle Cranky over the edge. Lando continues demonstrating that dirty air remains the greatest humanitarian crisis of our generation. Lando spends lap after lap after lap complaining.
Dirty air. Oscar's slow. I'm faster. Move him. Pit me. Do something. I'm faster.
Whinge. Ah yes, the annual Hungarian mating call of the entitled papaya Pomeranian. Oscar? Just quietly driving away. Smoothly, cleanly, managing the lead, exactly as you'd expect. Meanwhile, Lando making frustrated errors that Will was calmly trying to manage. Running wide, using curbs like they're optional, and taking the occasional scenic route outside the white lines. The irony is almost beautiful. The bloke accusing Oscar of being slow is making all the mistakes himself. Then comes the inevitable tantrum.
So you won't let me? I'll pull 10 seconds.
Really? 10 seconds? Mate, if you're that much quicker, why haven't you overtaken him? Because deep down, everyone knows the answer. Will is trying and failing to manage Lando's frustrated errors. Lando, just try and manage the snaps. Lando, be careful of those lockups. Errors, lots of errors while Oscar is making checks notes. None. Lando, that's another track limits infringement. Lando, I need you to avoid all exit curbs, please. At this point, it seems that Will is terrified that the stewards won't be able to ignore Lando's many messy off-track excursions. Lando, no exit curbs. McLando, fearing for Lando's race and image, decide that the only solution to Lando's error-filled, whinge-laden driving is to pit Oscar out of his way and give him the clean air he is demanding. Snake finally appears.
Box.
No! Don't listen to him, Oscar. We've seen this movie. It always ends with Lando somehow in front again. Deja vu again and again and again. But Oscar gets moved. Again. Lando gets exactly what he wanted. Clean air. Again. Apparently this time it was to cover Lewis. Righto. Except Oscar wasn't under threat from Lewis. And despite all that talk about having superior pace, Lando somehow forgets to actually produce any fastest laps before stopping. Then the commentary confidently announces, Lando will emerge ahead. But then they say, there's less than a pit stop between them. What? That math ain't mathing. Oscar gets dumped into traffic. Blue flags become optional. Lando stays out for several more laps despite insisting he needed to stop immediately prior to Oscar's forced pit stop. Honestly, Snake, how many times can someone fall for the same trick? Fool you once, shame on you. Fool you 30 times, and somehow you're still employed? How? Just how? We will take a brief intermission while I try to compose myself. a little zen moment of calm the F down. Because what happens next, well, that's where this race goes from frustrating to absolutely unbelievable. Carlos, the strategy, Oscar's radio, and one of the angriest moments we've ever heard from the usually ice-cold Australian. Trust me, part 2 is where Uncle Cranky really earns his name. Stay tuned for more McLando drama. Right. I've calmed down. No, I haven't. I've watched the second half again and somehow I'm even angrier. Let's finish this. Back into the race. Oscar comes out of the pits, straight into traffic. Back markers everywhere. That's not strategy, that's shenanigans. Alonso, Carlos, blue flags waving like they're trying to land a flaming aeroplane. And yet nobody moves and Carlos even goes out of his way to block Oscar. Oscar finally snaps.
Is he f***ing stupid or what? Get out of the f***ing way!
Now for Oscar, that's practically an expletive-laden meltdown. The bloke normally apologizes when someone else crashes into him. So if Oscar sounds that angry, something's gone seriously wrong. Carlos drives straight into Oscar, and even now, having watched it several times, I still struggle to understand what I was looking at. Because it genuinely looked like Carlos turned and accelerated straight into him.
You idiot. Oh my God!
Snake's response to this appalling situation?
All looks okay.
What? The f***? How is any of that okay? Now maybe he was referring to the car being okay rather than the situation itself, but cast your mind back to Silverstone. Oscar's car had the front wing dragging on the ground and it took 3 radio messages from Oscar and 2 laps for Snake to determine there was a problem. But suddenly here, he is somehow able to respond immediately that everything is okay? Something doesn't add up. Now, I really want to give Carlos the benefit of the doubt. I like Carlos. Everybody likes Carlos. He's always seemed like one of the genuinely decent blokes in the paddock. Maybe he genuinely didn't realize exactly where Oscar was. Maybe he was just trying to help his BFF Lando. I hope that's true, because the alternative is ugly. Very ugly. Carlos later says,
I had no idea Oscar was there. No idea. It was impossible for me to know when I'm fighting Alonso.
Really? No idea? Despite 7 blue flags lights and physical wave blue flags, the blue warning light flashing on the dash, and, most damning of all, his own team radio telling him Oscar was arriving and was in the lead? When you are last in the race, the blue flags are for you. They are always for you. Carlos' explanation doesn't exactly make the questions disappear. It makes it look like he was lying. Makes the move look even more intentional. Even the media described it as a bizarre incident with several possible explanations, though none of them was especially compelling. I'd agree with that. Because whatever happened, it cost Carlos nothing. 5-second penalty, when he was already last. But Oscar? Well, it cost him everything. Which again raises the question of stewarding inconsistencies. In Brazil last year, Oscar copped 10 seconds and a penalty point for a collision Kimi caused by moving under braking. But here, Carlos ignores 7 blue flags, gets clearly warned over the radio, then accelerates directly into Oscar, and continues holding him up for even more corners. And the penalty? Only 5 seconds. At this point, if you look at the penalties handed out since Oscar arrived, the pattern is getting harder and harder to ignore. Oscar gets hit with maximum penalties, sometimes even when the incident wasn't his fault, while anyone who costs Oscar positions gets no penalty, or one so small it changes absolutely nothing. It's starting to look like the FIA has decided an Aussie is never allowed to win. Liberty's marketing department really needs to read the room. The world keeps cheering for Oscar, while the booing for the drivers being protected by the chosen narrative, looking at you Lando and Kimi, is getting louder. You chose the wrong hero, lads, and the fans are making that very clear. Then Snake immediately jumps on the radio.
Oscar, that's Carlos that cost us that.
No. Oscar wasn't buying it for a second.
Oh, mate, just don't f***ing talk to me now. Nice of you guys to factor that one in, by the way. Thanks.
That wasn't anger. That was years of frustration finally boiling over. Oscar knew exactly why he'd been behind Carlos in the first place. Because he'd been boxed early into traffic because Lando demanded it. Again, if they waited just one lap later, he clears the traffic. One lap later, Lando doesn't get the undercut. One lap. That's all it would have taken. Later, Lando even admitted that he got the team to force Oscar to box, all while declaring he was better in every sense. Now correct me if I'm wrong, but if he was actually better in every sense as he claimed, then why did he need to force the team to box Oscar out of his way so he could win? If he really was better in every sense, then he wouldn't have needed the team to sabotage Oscar's race to help him. Careful, Lando, your entitlement's showing. Lando's stop is slightly slow. Naturally, the commentary team react like civilization is collapsing. Meanwhile, Oscar's more frequent slow stops this season have barely rated a mention. Funny how sympathy works. Lando's slow stop costs him less than 1 second more. Carlos taking Oscar out cost Oscar more than 7 seconds. And yet Lando exits the pits less than a second in front of Oscar. So how was that possible if Lando was so much faster in clean air as he claimed? Why wasn't he so far ahead that the slow stop didn't make any difference? Why do you need Carlos to take Oscar out to get in front? Meanwhile, from Lando, more complaints, more lockups, more curb hopping, more running wide. Wise Owl Will practically starts parenting him.
Lando, you have nothing to prove.
Exactly. Because the team had already done the work for him, with a lot of help from his BFF Carlos. The commentators start mentioning Oscar's helmet bouncing around inside the cockpit. Again. Clearly something isn't right. This was easily visible even before Carlos crashed him. The car looks horrible. He's fighting at every corner.
This car has been super inconsistent,
Oscar says with his usual subtlety. The difference is even more obvious when you compare the onboard cameras of Lando and Oscar. Oscar is still smooth and neat, but it takes a ton more effort to keep it that way. Lando looks like he is out for a Sunday drive, but is all over the road and frequently off it too. Messy mistakes everywhere, despite it being obvious his car isn't bouncing like Oscar's is. Despite that, once Oscar finally clears Kimi, his pace suddenly comes alive. He's catching Lando. The gap starts coming down. You can almost feel the pressure building. Then, lap 56. Disaster.
I lost the gearbox.
No! You've got to be kidding me. Poor Oscar, because apparently this season the Librarity writers have decided if Oscar survives the strategy, then break the car. Honestly, that didn't even sound like a normal gearbox failure. It sounded odd. Draw your own conclusions. I'm simply telling you what it sounded like. Whatever happened, Oscar's race was over. Lando gets to pit under the safety car caused by Oscar's car giving up and goes on to softs, which were clearly the faster tyre. This allows Lando to pull out a gap, with that being evidence of his superior speed, when they literally had no comparison to Oscar because Oscar never raced with the softs. So to be clear, the only time Lando was actually faster than Oscar was on the softs, which means his whole whingy rant about being faster in clean air was, as usual, nothing but BS. Lewis gets a perfectly fair pit lane speeding penalty. Rules are rules. Then 4 laps from home, the commentators announce, "That's another track limits infringement for Lando." Yep, another one. By this stage, the broadcast itself has mentioned 5. 5. Yet somehow no investigation, no penalty, no problem. Remarkable consistency. Lando is British, of course. So Lando is gifted another win by team strategy sabotaging Oscar. Yes, sabotage. Again.
Woo! Beautiful!
Lando talks in a way that sounds like he is covering, like he knows something dodgy went on and clearly he was in on it. Just like Hungary last year. Remember how we said Lando is only really excited by a win when it comes at the expense of Oscar? When he knows that Oscar has been totally and utterly shafted? Well, this was one of those. Max somehow drags that difficult Red Bull into second, which tells you more about Max than it does about the car. Kimi finishes third, Charles fourth, and Oscar? Another race win that looked like it slipped away one team decision at a time through no fault of his own. That's 3 this year already. Now here's something interesting. Watching the podium broadcasts, the crowd sounds odd. Very quiet. Too quiet. Yet fans at the circuit reported plenty of booing. Booing Lando relentlessly. Whether that's simply television audio mixing or something else, I can't say. But it's certainly interesting how different the television sounded compared with reports from people who were actually there. Watch for it yourselves next time. See what you think. I've said it before and I will say it again. Most F1 fans aren't stupid. Turns out the fans aren't nearly as stupid as they would need to be to believe that Lando wasn't gifted yet another undeserved win. The more they manipulate wins for him, the more the fans see it and hate him for it. History will not be kind to Lando, no matter what his classless father believes. George, understandably disappointed with his car being much slower than Kimmy's, summed things up rather nicely afterwards.
Of course, I'm not happy with how things have gone.
He goes on to say,
There are lots of things out of your control that may work against you.
fair comment. Sometimes there are. Looking at you, Toto. Then Stella incorrectly explains,
Once Lando was released, then his pace was simply mega. I think he found half a second per lap, and this pace meant that Lando could be ahead of Oscar.
except Oscar himself later points out, I was just very, very pissed off in the moment about what happened. Without getting crashed into, I would have been ahead of Lando still. And when you actually look at the timing, that does seem to line up rather well. Hard to misunderstand that. The timing shows that the only lap that Lando gained any time on Oscar was the lap that Carlos impeded and then crashed into Oscar. So you have to wonder if Stella was talking about Carlos releasing Lando. Oscar, furious with his team but unable to say what he really thought about the overt McLando favoritism, he instead focused on Carlos saying it was one of the dumbest things. For me, there's no excuse at all. Carlos was fighting Alonso for last place like it was the World Championship. It cost me the lead of the race. Then Stella says something else.
On other tracks, probably Lando might have overtaken Oscar.
Might have? Probably? Interesting choice of words. Because if you have to keep explaining hypothetical overtakes, perhaps the actual overtakes aren't happening. Then comes my favorite corporate sentence of the weekend.
You constantly evaluate all the options. You can look at what's the way to score as many points for the team, but there's also a way to be consistent with the way we go racing.
Consistent? Yes, very consistent. Somehow. Every evaluation seems to end with Lando benefiting. Every single one. Remarkable coincidence. More than 30 times in a row. Very consistent, yes, but fair? Not even close. One moment that caught my eye. Casey Stoner speaking to Stella after the race. No microphones, no audio, just body language. I don't know what was said, neither do you. But Casey didn't look very happy and Stella didn't look particularly comfortable. Stella suddenly developed a fascinating interest in looking anywhere except Casey's eyes. Maybe they were discussing the weather. Maybe they weren't. Then the commentators suggest Oscar's gearbox failed because of curb hopping. Really? Oscar? The bloke everyone keeps telling us is too smooth? The bloke Stella himself claimed drives too smoothly? Now suddenly he's breaking gearboxes by abusing curbs? Meanwhile, Lando spends the afternoon launching across every curb in Hungary and his gearbox survives just fine. Funny old world. Later it was said that the gearbox damage was a direct result of the collision with Carlos and absolutely nothing to do with Oscar's driving. Did they retract their victim blaming of Oscar? Of course not. How would that help Lando? Now remember when I said Oscar's gearbox failure sounded odd? Well, Stella later revealed that Oscar doesn't need a new gearbox because apparently there was nothing wrong with the gearbox. Nothing wrong? But it just stopped. And that very convenient nothing happening just happened to hand Lando another win, as totally undeserved as last year's. Yep, nothing suspicious there at all. Then Lando says,
It was fun pushing Oscar into mistakes.
Mate, which mistakes? Because from where I was sitting, you were the one locking brakes. You were the one running wide. You were the one collecting track limits. Oscar looked like the calm one. Not a single error on Oscar's part. But it did show Lando's true colors. Imagine saying something so belittling and so wrong after the team just stole the win from Oscar and gifted it to you. So much entitlement. Then Lando says,
I owe the team a lot.
well, that's probably the most accurate thing anybody said all weekend. Understatement of the year. You owe the team for this win as well as the WDC, and you owe Oscar an apology. Honestly, one of the most disappointing parts of this whole mess was Carlos refusing to apologize to Oscar, and then dismiss it with,
That's just racing.
no, Carlos. It isn't just racing, when you aren't even on the same lap. Oscar was fighting for the lead. Carlos was battling Alonso for last place, while ignoring multiple blue flags and clear warnings from his own team that Oscar was behind him. Then he drove into Oscar, cost him crucial time, and helped create the exact gap Lando needed to inherit the lead. And instead of taking responsibility and saying, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, Carlos doubled down. Unfortunately, that refusal to own it only adds fuel to the growing fan belief that it may have been intentional, that Carlos was helping his best mate Lando. Whether that was his intention or not, dismissing it as just racing has cost Carlos a lot of respect. And, I suspect, a lot of fans. Do better, Carlos Hair. And finally, the commentators start reminiscing.
Lando should have won here in 2024.
Should have won 3 in a row. No. In 2024, Oscar won Hungary, in my memory, long before he officially won it. Oscar should have won again in 25, but the whole team conspired against him to steal the win. And he was on track to win again this weekend, but for a repeat of Lando favoring strategy. Hungary has become the place where Oscar seems to do everything right, and somehow still leaves empty-handed. That's why people get frustrated. Not because somebody else wins. That's racing. People get frustrated when they feel they're watching the outcome being shaped by everything except the driver's racing ability. Whether you agree with me or not, that's the conversation fans are having. And Formula One ignores that conversation at its own peril. Social media was full of people now saying they can no longer ignore the clear, unacceptable favoritism for Lando. Many were fans who were tentatively okay with the favoritism last year as a reward for Lando's loyalty, but they are now questioning how long that favoritism must continue. How long does Oscar have to be there before he is treated with respect and equality that he earned by being a genuine team player? The fans are firing up. They don't think the Carlos crash was an accident. They think it was deliberately engineered to help Lando. They don't believe that Lando got ahead because he was faster, because the evidence just doesn't support that. They no longer believe that McLaren are being fair and equal when every decision somehow favors Lando at Oscar's expense. Every single one. The neutral fans saw through it last year in Qatar, but now even the more die-hard McLando fans are having trouble believing the Lando the Great narrative. We all saw with our own eyes and ears how Lando was gifted the win at Oscar's expense. Unlike last year, we all saw and heard the radio messages proving Oscar's race was sabotaged to help the whinging Lando. The narrative has long since stopped being believable. The fans are noticing, but McLando continue to push their narrative. The problem for McLando isn't that people disagree with them. The problem is McLando genuinely think the fans are too stupid to notice. But we do notice. Every single time. The booing doesn't lie. Look, fans don't hate team orders. Fans hate pretending there weren't team orders. Fans don't hate strategy. Fans hate strategy that somehow always benefits the same bloke. Fans don't hate championships. They hate feeling like they're watching one that's being stage managed. Motorsport is brilliant because the fastest driver is supposed to win. If you keep making the strategy decide the result, eventually people stop caring who crossed the line first. Anyway, that's enough from Uncle Cranky. My blood pressure monitor has just filed for workers' compensation. If you enjoyed the episode, give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you'd like to help keep Uncle Cranky supplied with blood pressure tablets and Papaya Koala supplied with eucalyptus leaves, consider joining the channel or buying us a coffee, link below. Until next time, stay safe, stay skeptical, and remember, if someone keeps telling you not to believe your own eyes, it's usually worth looking a little closer. Uncle Cranky Koala out. Thanks for taking out Oscar for me. Anytime, because you're worth it.